The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Samuel Garrett's weathered face as he chopped wood behind his small cabin. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly before him, a harsh landscape of red rocks and desert scrub that had claimed so many dreams. His own dream was barely hanging on by a thread. Samuel had been alone on his homestead for 3 months now, ever since his wife Mary died from fever. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and some days he went without speaking a single word aloud. The silence had become his companion, broken only by the wind whistling through the canyon walls and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. At 32 years old, Samuel had the hands of a man much older. Years of farming back in Missouri, then the journey west. And now this constant battle against the unforgiving desert had left their mark. His brown hair was streaked with premature gray, and deep lines surrounded his blue eyes from squinting against the endless sun. He paused in his chopping, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. The water barrel was getting low again, which meant another trip to the creek 2 miles away. Everything here required such effort, such planning. Back home, water came from a well just 50 feet from the house. Here, every drop was precious. The sound that made him freeze wasn't anything he could identify at first. It was somewhere between a moan and a whimper, carried on the desert wind. Samuel set down his axe and listened carefully. Living alone had sharpened his senses. Every sound could mean the difference between life and death out here. There it was again, coming from the direction of the rocky outcropping about 100 yards north of his cabin. Samuel walked slowly toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he always kept nearby. Mountain lions sometimes came down from the higher elevations when water was scarce. A wounded animal could be especially dangerous. As he rounded the largest boulder, Samuel stopped dead in his tracks. What he saw made his heart pound, not with fear, but with shock and confusion. A young Apache woman lay crumpled against the rock face, her long black hair matted with blood and dirt. Her doeskin dress was torn and stained dark with what looked like dried blood. Samuel's first instinct was to back away. Relations between settlers and the Apache had been tense for years. Just last month he'd heard stories from town about raids on homesteads 50 miles south. The army patrol that occasionally passed through always warned settlers to be cautious, but as he watched, the woman tried to lift her head and failed, falling back against the rocks with another soft moan. Her left leg was twisted at an odd angle, clearly broken. Fresh blood seeped through a makeshift bandage around her thigh, and her lips were cracked and white from dehydration. Samuel found himself taking a step forward instead of backward. This wasn't a warrior preparing to attack. This was a human being who was dying. "Miss?" He called softly, not knowing if she could understand English. "Miss, are you hurt?" The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with a mixture of pain and wariness. When she saw Samuel, she tried to push herself further back against the rocks, but she was too weak to move much. She spoke in rapid Apache, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. She was afraid. "I'm not going to hurt you," Samuel said, holding his hands up to show he wasn't armed. "You're hurt. You need help." The woman continued to watch him with those dark eyes, her breathing shallow and rapid. Samuel could see she was trying to assess whether he was a threat. Smart, he thought. Out here, that kind of caution kept people alive. Samuel slowly sat down on a rock about 10 feet away, making himself less threatening. "My name is Samuel," he said, pointing to himself. "Samuel Garrett? I live in that cabin over there." He gestured toward his home. "You're hurt bad? That leg needs setting, and you need water." The woman said nothing, but Samuel noticed her eyes flick toward his cabin when he pointed to it. She was listening, even if she didn't understand all his words. "I'm going to get some water," Samuel said, standing up slowly. "I'll be right back. Don't try to move." He walked back to his cabin, his mind racing. What was he doing? Taking in an Apache woman could bring trouble from both sides. If her people came looking for her, they might see him as an enemy who had captured her. If other settlers found out, they'd call him a traitor or worse. But as Samuel filled his water bucket and gathered clean cloth for bandages, He kept seeing those dark eyes filled with pain and fear. Mary would have helped without hesitation. She always said a person's character was measured by how they treated those who couldn't help themselves. When Samuel returned to the rocks, the woman was still conscious, but barely. He approached slowly, talking in a calm, steady voice. "I've got water and some cloth for bandages. I know you can't understand all my words, but I hope you can hear in my voice that I mean no harm." Samuel set the water bucket down and dipped a cloth in it. The woman tensed as he approached, but she was too weak to resist when he gently wiped the blood and dirt from her face. The cool water seemed to revive her slightly. "Water," Samuel said, lifting a ladle to her lips. "Water." The woman drank eagerly, some of the liquid running down her chin. After a few sips, she spoke a single word in Apache, then repeated it while looking at the ladle. "Is that your word for water?" Samuel asked. When she nodded slightly, he repeated the sound as best he could. She almost smiled before another wave of pain crossed her features. Samuel examined her injuries as gently as possible. The leg was definitely broken below the knee, and the wound on her thigh looked like it came from a bullet or arrow. It had been treated with what looked like herbs and plant materials, but infection was setting in. "This is going to hurt," Samuel warned, though he knew she probably couldn't understand. "But I need to get you to my cabin." "You'll die out here in this heat?" The woman seemed to understand his intention when he positioned himself to lift her. She shook her head and spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing back toward the mountains. Samuel gathered she was trying to tell him her people were that way, but she was too injured to make such a journey. "Your people aren't here now," Samuel said gently. "I am, and I'm not leaving you to die." When Samuel carefully lifted the woman in his arms, she cried out in pain but didn't struggle. She was lighter than he expected, probably from days without proper food and water. As he carried her toward his cabin, Samuel noticed she kept her eyes on the mountains to the east, as if hoping to see someone coming for her. Inside his small cabin, Samuel had to make quick decisions. The cabin was just 2 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen and fireplace, and a small bedroom where he and Mary had slept. He gently placed the Apache woman on his own bed. The only soft surface available, she looked around the cabin with curious eyes, taking in the simple furniture, the photographs on the mantelpiece, and the women's clothes still hanging on pegs near the bedroom door. When her gaze fell on Mary's blue calico dress, something in her expression softened. "That was my wife's," Samuel explained, following her gaze. "She died 3 months ago. Fever." Even though she couldn't understand the words, the Apache woman seemed to grasp the meaning. She looked back at Samuel with what might have been sympathy in her dark eyes. Samuel heated water on the stove and gathered his limited medical supplies. He'd learned basic doctoring from necessity. The nearest real doctor was a 2-day ride to town. As he prepared to clean and rebandage her wounds, the woman watched his every movement. "This is going to hurt," Samuel repeated as he began cleaning the infected wound on her thigh. The woman bit down on her lip but made no sound, though tears ran down her cheeks. Samuel worked as quickly and gently as he could, applying a poultice Mary had taught him to make from desert plants. The broken leg was more complicated. Samuel had set bones before, but always on animals. Never on a person, and certainly never on someone who couldn't understand his explanations or warnings. "I need to straighten this leg," Samuel said, positioning his hands carefully. "It's going to hurt terribly, but if I don't do it, you might never walk properly again." The woman seemed to understand the seriousness in his voice. She gripped the edge of the blanket with both hands and nodded once. Samuel pulled and set the bone as quickly as possible. The woman's scream echoed through the small cabin, then she fainted from the pain. In some ways, Samuel was grateful. It made splinting the leg much easier. By the time the Apache woman regained consciousness, the sun was setting through the cabin's single window. Samuel had spent the afternoon making her as comfortable as possible, changing her bandages and trying to get fluids into her whenever she was awake enough to drink. She opened her eyes and immediately tried to sit up, looking around the cabin as if trying to remember where she was. When she saw Samuel sitting in a chair nearby, the wariness returned to her expression. "You're safe," Samuel said quietly. "I've set your leg and cleaned your wounds. You need to rest." The woman spoke in Apache, her voice stronger than it had been that morning. Samuel wished desperately that he could understand what she was saying. Was she asking about her people? Demanding to be released? Thanking him for his help? "I wish I could understand you," Samuel said. "But even if I could, I'd tell you the same thing. You're too hurt to travel. Even if your people come looking, they'll want you all." 3 weeks had passed since Samuel found Ayana collapsed against the rocks. The morning routine had become as natural as breathing, checking her wounds, helping her with water and food, and the slow, patient work of learning to communicate across the vast divide of language and culture. Ayana could now sit up without assistance, and had begun taking her first tentative steps around the cabin using a walking stick Samuel had carved for her. The broken bone was healing well, though it would be months before she could walk normally again. The bullet wound on her thigh had closed completely, leaving only a pale scar that would fade with time. Samuel found himself looking forward to their conversations, even though they remained a mixture of broken English, simple Apache words, and elaborate gestures. Ayana was a quick learner, picking up new English words daily. More importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding his world, just as he was fascinated by glimpses into hers. "Samuel," Ayana said one morning, pointing toward Mary's garden plot behind the cabin. The small fenced area had been neglected since Mary's death, and weeds now grew where vegetables once flourished. "Plants?" Samuel followed her gaze and felt the familiar pang of grief. Mary had loved that garden, spending hours each day tending the tomatoes, beans, and squash that had provided much of their food. "Garden," Samuel said. "My wife ... She grew food there." He made gestures to indicate planting and harvesting. Ayana nodded thoughtfully, then spoke in Apache while miming various actions. Samuel gathered she was talking about plants and growing things. She pointed to herself, then to the neglected garden, and raised her eyebrows in a question. "You want to help with the garden?" Samuel asked. Understanding her meaning, if not her exact words, Ayana smiled, the first real smile Samuel had seen from her. It transformed her entire face, making her look younger and lighting up her dark eyes. She nodded enthusiastically and said something else in Apache. "You'll need to be careful with that leg," Samuel warned, but he found himself smiling back. The idea of bringing Mary's garden back to life appealed to him more than he wanted to admit. That afternoon, Samuel helped Ayana outside for the first time since he'd carried her into the cabin. She moved slowly, leaning heavily on the walking stick, but her face showed determination rather than pain. The desert air seemed to revive her spirits. Ayana examined the garden plot carefully, running her hands through the soil and pulling up some of the weeds to study them. She spoke to Samuel in Apache, pointing to different areas and making gestures he didn't understand. "I wish I knew what you were saying," Samuel said with frustration. "You clearly know about plants and growing things." Ayana seemed to sense his frustration. She picked up a stick and began drawing in the dirt, creating simple pictures to illustrate her ideas. First, she drew what looked like corn plants, then beans growing up them, and squash spreading around the base. "You know about companion planting," Samuel said with amazement. "Mary used to do something similar, but not exactly like this." Excited by his understanding, Ayana drew more pictures in the dirt. She showed him irrigation methods using channels and small dams, ways to prepare soil with plant materials, and techniques for protecting young plants from desert heat. Samuel realized he was seeing centuries of Apache farming wisdom condensed into simple drawings. These weren't primitive people scratching out a basic existence, as he'd been taught to believe. They were skilled agriculturalists who had learned to make the harsh desert bloom. "Show me," Samuel said simply. Over the following days, working together in the garden became their shared project. Ayana couldn't do heavy work with her injured leg, but she directed Samuel in preparing the soil, showing him how to dig shallow channels for water retention and how to mix desert plants into the earth to improve its quality. Samuel had always thought of the desert as empty and lifeless, But through Ayana's eyes, he began to see it differently. She showed him edible plants he'd walked past for months without noticing. She taught him which roots could be ground into nutritious flour and which leaves could be brewed into medicinal teas. "This," Ayana said one afternoon, pointing to a plant Samuel had always considered a weed. She mimed eating and rubbed her stomach approvingly. "That's food?" Samuel asked skeptically. Ayana laughed, another sound Samuel had come to treasure. She carefully dug up the plant and showed him the thick root beneath the surface. Using gestures and broken English, she explained how to prepare it. That evening, Ayana insisted on helping Samuel prepare dinner. She couldn't stand for long periods, but she could sit at the table and work with the plant she'd shown him. Under her guidance, Samuel peeled and chopped the root, then cooked it with their usual beans. The result was a revelation. The root added a nutty flavor and hearty texture that made their simple meal more satisfying than anything Samuel had eaten in months. "It's good," Samuel said with surprise. "Really good. What do you call it?" Ayana spoke the Apache name, then helped Samuel pronounce it correctly. As they ate, she told him about other desert plants his tongue could learn to appreciate. Using their growing shared vocabulary and patient gestures after dinner, they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset over the endless desert landscape. Ayana had grown strong enough to enjoy these evening conversations, and Samuel looked forward to them all day. Tonight, she seemed more talkative than usual. "Samuel," she said carefully, "where? Your family? Not wife, others?" Samuel understood she was asking about his parents, siblings, the extended family that formed the foundation of Apache society. It was a painful topic, but he found he wanted to share with her. "My parents died when I was young," Samuel explained slowly, using simple words she would understand. "Sickness. No brothers or sisters. Mary was my family." Ayana listened intently, her face serious. When he finished, she spoke in Apache for several minutes, her tone gentle and sympathetic. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he felt the compassion behind them. "Tell me about your family," Samuel said. "Your people." Ayana's expression became complicated. She looked toward the mountains where her people lived and spoke slowly in English mixed with Apache. "My father, chief important man. My mother—" She paused, searching for words. "Mother teaches girls? How to she gestured helplessly, how to be women." Samuel suggested. "How to take care of families? Yes." Ayana nodded enthusiastically. "Mother teaches. I learn. But I also—" She mimed riding a horse and shooting a bow. "I fight. Like men sometimes." Samuel wasn't entirely surprised. He'd noticed Ayana's self-confidence and the way she observed everything around her with a warrior's alertness. Among her people, apparently, women could be more than just wives and mothers. "You were with warriors when you were hurt?" Samuel asked. Ayana's face darkened. She nodded and spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice becoming angry. Samuel caught a few English words: soldiers, attack, kill, and understood she was reliving the violence that had separated her from her people. "I'm sorry," Samuel said quietly. "I'm sorry that happened to you." Ayana looked at him with those penetrating dark eyes. "You—" "Different," she said carefully. "Other white men. They see Apache, they shoot. You see hurt person, you help." Samuel felt uncomfortable with her gratitude. Any decent person would have helped. But even as he said it, Samuel knew it wasn't true. Most settlers in this territory would have left an Apache woman to die or worse. The decades of conflict had created hatred and fear on both sides that made compassion seem like weakness or betrayal. "Why?" Ayana asked simply. "Why you help enemy?" The word enemy hit Samuel like a physical blow. Is that what she was? Is that what he was to her? The question forced him to examine his own motivations in a way he'd been avoiding. "You're not my enemy," Samuel said finally. "I don't know what you are, but you're not that?" Ayana studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I not know what you are too, but not enemy." It was a small declaration, but it felt momentous sitting there under the vast desert sky. Two people from cultures that had been taught to hate and fear each other had found something different, something that defied the simple categories of friend and enemy. As the weeks passed, their conversations grew deeper and more complex. Ayana's English improved rapidly, and Samuel began picking up more Apache words and phrases. They talked about their different beliefs, their customs, their ways of understanding the world. Samuel learned that Apache society was far more complex than he'd imagined. They had sophisticated systems of governance, intricate spiritual beliefs, and rich oral traditions that preserved thousands of years of wisdom. Ayana was not just the daughter of a chief, but an educated woman in her own right, trained in herbal medicine, astronomy, and the complex social protocols that governed Apache life. In return, Samuel shared his own background, his childhood on a Missouri farm, his dreams of building a new life in the West, his grief over Mary's death, and his struggles with loneliness and doubt. "You sad man when I come," Ayana observed one evening. "Eyes like winter sky, now different." Samuel realized she was right. The crushing loneliness that had been his constant companion since Mary's death had lifted without his noticing. Having someone to talk to care for, to share meals and conversations with had brought him back to life in. The decision came sooner than either Samuel or Ayana had wanted. 6 weeks after Samuel found her bleeding against the rocks, Ayana spotted dust clouds on the eastern horizon that could only mean one thing: riders were approaching. And in Apache territory, that likely meant her people had finally tracked her down. "They come," Ayana said quietly, pointing toward the distant dust. Her voice carried a mixture of relief and sadness that Samuel understood completely. Samuel felt his stomach clench with anxiety. Everything would depend on how Ayana's people interpreted the situation they found. Would they see a white settler who had helped their injured daughter, or would they see a kidnapper who had been holding her against her will? "What do you want to tell them?" Samuel asked, watching the dust clouds grow larger. Ayana considered this carefully. Over the past weeks, they had discussed this moment many times, but now that it was actually happening, the weight of their decision felt enormous. "Truth," she said simply. "I tell them Samuel Garrett saved my life. I tell them about kindness and friendship." She looked at him with those penetrating dark eyes. "But Samuel, you must be careful. Some of my people, they're not ready for this truth." Samuel nodded, understanding. Just as many white settlers would view his actions as treason, some Apache warriors might see Ayana's extended stay with a white man as collaboration with their enemies. They spent the morning preparing for what might be their final conversation. Ayana had regained enough strength to walk without the cane, though she still favored her injured leg. She braided her long black hair in the traditional Apache style and wore one of her own doeskin dresses that Samuel had carefully cleaned and mended. "You look like yourself again," Samuel observed, though the words carried a note of sadness. The transformation reminded him that she belonged to another world, one he could never fully enter. "I am myself," Ayana replied, "but I am also different now. Because of you. Because of this time." By midday, the riders were close enough to count. Samuel saw 6 Apache warriors on horseback, moving in the careful formation of experienced trackers. They had found what they were looking for. Ayana stood outside the cabin, clearly visible to the approaching riders. Samuel remained near the door, close enough to show he wasn't holding her prisoner, but far enough away to avoid appearing threatening. The lead rider was a man in his 50s with the bearing of natural authority. Even at a distance, Samuel could see the family resemblance. This had to be Ayana's father, the chief she had spoken of with such respect. When the riders were still 50 yards away, Ayana called out in Apache. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but her tone was respectful and reassuring. She was telling them she was safe, he realized. The chief raised his hand to halt his warriors, then rode forward alone. Samuel watched as father and daughter had an intense conversation in rapid Apache. Ayana gestured toward Samuel several times, and each time her father's stern gaze fixed on the white settler, who had somehow become central to his daughter's story. Finally, Ayana switched to English, speaking loudly enough for Samuel to hear. "Father, this is Samuel Garrett. He saved my life when soldiers shot me. He gave medicine, food, shelter. Without him, I die." The chief studied Samuel for a long moment. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear. "My daughter tells unusual story," he said. "White man helps Apache woman. This thing, it does not happen often." "Your daughter was hurt and dying," Samuel replied carefully. "Any decent person would have helped." The chief's weathered face showed skepticism. "You know what my people and your people do to each other? You know helping Apache woman could bring trouble from your own kind?" "Yes," Samuel admitted. "I knew that, yet you help anyway. Why?" It was the question Samuel had been dreading and hoping for. How could he explain the complex emotions and moral calculations that had led him to risk everything for a stranger? "Because it was the right thing to do," Samuel said finally. "Because I couldn't live with myself if I left another human being to die when I had the power to help." The chief nodded slowly, as if Samuel had confirmed something he already suspected. "My daughter says you treat her with respect. Like honored guest, not prisoner?" "She was my guest," Samuel said. "An injured guest who needed care. She also says you learn our ways. You let her teach you about desert plants, about growing food." The chief's tone became slightly less formal. "She says you are a good student." Despite the tension of the moment, Samuel almost smiled. "She's an excellent teacher. I learned more about living in the desert from her in 6 weeks than I had in a year of trying on my own." The chief turned back to his daughter and spoke in Apache. Ayana responded at length, her voice becoming animated as she described their weeks together. Samuel caught occasional English words mixed in with the Apache garden, medicine, friend, and hoped she was painting an accurate picture of their time together. When Ayana finished speaking, her father sat silently on his horse for what felt like an eternity. The other warriors maintained their positions, weapons ready but not threatening, waiting for their chief's decision. Finally, the older man dismounted and walked toward Samuel. Every instinct told Samuel to step back or reach for a weapon, but he forced himself to stand still and keep his hands visible. The chief stopped just arm's length away and extended his right hand. "I am Nayeli," he said formally. "War chief of the Chiricahua Apache, father of Ayana." Samuel grasped the offered hand, feeling the strength in the older man's grip. "Samuel Garrett, Homesteader, friend of your daughter." "Friend?" Nayeli repeated thoughtfully. "Strong word. Dangerous word between our peoples." "Yes," Samuel agreed. "But true word?" Nayeli studied Samuel's face intently, as if trying to read the secrets of his soul. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, at least partially. "You give my daughter back her life," Nayeli said. "This creates debt, obligation, among my people. Such debt is sacred." Samuel wasn't sure where this was leading, but he sensed the importance of his response. "I asked for nothing in return. Helping her was its own reward." "Perhaps," Nayeli said. "But debt remains. And now I must decide what this debt means." The chief walked over to examine the garden where Samuel and Ayana had worked together. He knelt and ran soil through his fingers, studying the careful irrigation channels and the healthy plants growing there. "Apache techniques," he observed. "My daughter taught you well." "She did," Samuel confirmed. "She probably saved my life too in a different way. I was barely surviving out here before she showed me how to really live in the desert." Nayeli stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "So you save each other? Interesting." The chief called to his warriors in Apache, and they dismounted but kept their weapons ready. Then he sat down in the shade of Samuel's cabin and gestured for both Samuel and Ayana to join him. "We talk," Nayeli announced. "We decide what happens now." What followed was the most extraordinary conversation of Samuel's life. For 3 hours, the Apache war chief questioned him about his life, his beliefs, his intentions toward the Apache people, and his understanding of the conflict between their cultures. Ayana translated when necessary, but increasingly Nayeli spoke directly to Samuel in English. The older man was clearly testing not just Samuel's words but his character. Looking for signs of deception or hidden hostility. Samuel answered every question as honestly as he could. He admitted his previous ignorance about Apache culture. He acknowledged the wrongs committed by both sides in their ongoing conflict. He spoke about his grief over Mary's death and his gratitude for Ayana's companionship during his darkest period. "You understand this friendship is dangerous?" Nayeli asked at one point. "My people will not all approve. Your people will approve even less." "I understand," Samuel said. "But some things are worth the risk." "What things?" Samuel looked at Ayana, who sat quietly listening to this discussion of her fate. "The chance to prove that people can choose understanding over hatred. The hope that maybe, someday, our peoples can find peace." Nayeli followed his gaze to his daughter. "And what of Ayana?" "She is not married. Among our people, unmarried woman living alone with man. This brings questions." The implication hung heavy in the desert air. Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he forced himself to meet the chief's steady gaze. "Your daughter was injured and needed care," Samuel said firmly. "I treated her with the same respect I would show my own sister. Nothing happened between us that would dishonor her or shame your family." "I believe you," Nayeli said after a moment. "My daughter is good judge of character. If she trusted you, you deserve trust." As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, Nayeli finally announced his decision. "Ayana comes home with us," he said. "This is necessary. Her place is with her people." Samuel nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He had expected this, but expectation didn't make it easier. "However," Nayeli continued, "debt remains. And friendship, once made, should not be easily broken." The chief stood and walked to where his horse was grazing. From his saddlebags he retrieved a beautifully crafted Apache knife in an ornate sheath. "This belonged to my father," Nayeli said, offering the weapon to Samuel. "And his father before him? I give it now to Samuel Garrett, friend of the Apache, savior of my daughter."